and this talk is going to go through sort of where we were in disaster management, where you are in disaster management and crisis management, what the threat environment looks like to you. I figure you all are the experts in that. And then 3 of the 8 lessons that I give in my book of things that I want you to think about. And how I do this is, like, look, no one's going to read a book on disaster management, like, boring, right? What I do is I study disasters from the past, crises from the past, and what can we learn from them to help guide us for the future, right? It's a field of study. This is why, because it turns out that there are common things that link all of these that you can get ready for now. And that's why you're here. And I know that's why that's the effort that you're going to be exploring in the days ahead. Okay, this is the old system, right? Slide, you call it slide left, slide right, left a boom and right a boom, right? Prevention and protection, right? Locks on the cockpit door, go after the terrorists in Afghanistan, but the thing happens. The boom. And remember, I'm agnostic on the boom. I started off in counterterrorism. I'm an all hazards person now because I couldn't, because like, how can you ignore all this stuff? Like cyber, pandemics, whatever. I think about the boom and right a boom, right? Response, immediate response, which you're going to see in the next 48 hours in Florida with Milton. Recovery, which you're going to start to see with Helene in those areas, and then what this generic word, resiliency, right? That world of rainbows and unicorns that we all dream of, and no one knows how to get there, right? Okay, this is old. Because this viewed disasters as random and rare. This is the system that we set up, right? You sort of pop up, something bad happens, there, but for the grace of God go I. Poor person lost their house, poor victim lost their house. This community got destroyed. Let's throw them a lot of money because who could have known, right? This is the new system, right? Of course, it's thinking about disaster management as not just not a moment in time, but right as part of a loop of investments that you're making at both the left side of the boom and right side of boom to do what? So this is the way we're thinking about now. Remember, I'm agnostic about the boom, right? I don't know what it's going to be. You may have some sense for your company, some sense about your networks, but I'm going to be agnostic about the boom. What are those investments you can make? Because the investments left of boom are certainly going to help you right a boom and vice versa. Our public policy is not there yet. Our politics are not there yet. The way we think about it is not there yet. But this is likely what you're experiencing, and we're just behind you, right? And the devil never sleeps. Is trying to reconceive of this system. So what are you in terms of this? Right, this infinite loop. So what is it that we're trying to do, right? Well, one is we're trying to think about risk in a way that is helpful to the most number of people. So many of you all of you are in risk, presumably. You know this chart. What am I worried about? Right? And this is how we think about risk and disaster and crisis management, right? I've got my low probability, low consequence, high probability, high consequence. That's a lot of probability and risk that I'm worried about. And we put them into different quadrants, right? Car accidents, high probability, low consequence. Low consequence, not maybe for the person who had the car accident, they could be injured, but low consequence overall for society, right? And we have systems that are adapting to this, or not adapt. There are systems that cover this, right? Insurance, permitting. The fact that I keep going back to my sons. I love them dearly, but they cost a lot on insurance, on car insurance, and so it's like, and so just there are systems in place to regularize that first quadrant. The second quadrant that I'm not going to worry about, that likely most of you don't worry about, right? I mean, you're experiencing from a cyber perspective high probability, low consequence all the time. Presumably, lots of stuff is happening, right? And you can sort of deal with it, and you know how to deal with it. This, you're not going to set up your system around the low probability, low consequence event. And these are the selfie stick deaths. And my apologies to anyone who knows anyone that this happened to, but we get a couple dozen deaths a year of people who really want that Instagram picture, right? And apparently the Grand Canyon, they learn the Grand Canyon and gravity aren't a good combination, right? I mean, but you're not going to set your security system around this. Maybe you'll put up signs, don't lean over this thing. But you're not so worried about this. It's this that you have to be worried about. And in some ways, it's disrupting our risk calculation, right? So remember, I'm a right of boom person. I'm worried about the crash landing, right? I'm going to assume, I know all sorts of things need to be done left of boom, but I'm going to assume that crash landing. And so then I just think about what are my high consequence events, whether it's what's called the gray rhino, which is, of course, your high probability, high likelihood event, Florida hurricanes, right? I know this is going to happen. It shouldn't be a surprise. And gray rhino is a rejoinder to what most of you, the terminology most of you have already heard about the black swan event. Right, the high consequence, low probability event. Who could have known that would have happened? 9/11, right? Then, that we weren't expecting it. But the consequences tend to be the same, whatever the risk is, whatever your probability is. And that's just a way to think about it. We can get so stuck on thinking about risk silos, right? Does this happen? Is this 10%? Is this 20%? Is this 30%? That we forget that the consequences are likely to be the same. And that's what we can learn from previous disasters. I can't tell you what the fluke is going to be. Once again, I'm agnostic about the boom. I'm just going to, who would have thought Helene, right? In areas so far from the coast. But I know what you need at the moment of it. And that's what I want to discuss in the slides to come. But I didn't want to take a moment just to put your, I like bullets and PowerPoints, bullet points and PowerPoints. But, just basically, you know what the threat environment is, right? The three major things that you're facing, of course, are significant data breaches. Already in Wired Magazine, I think I have the link embedded. Wired Magazine said in 2024 already, sort of a 1 billion plus in losses based on these significant data breaches. We know the companies, we know who they are. Right, and I'll get a little bit into who the culprits are, but we know what's happening. The second, newer and consequential, is your high-profile supply chain attacks. I mean, we know this is basically your third-party vulnerability, right? I had never heard of Chance Healthcare before. It was hacked, and I had no idea if it's infiltration into our healthcare system until it was attacked. Right? I mean, who hears that? Who had heard of Colonial Pipeline? I hadn't. Right? I knew there's companies like that, but I hadn't. These are so this becomes these high-profile supply chain incidents in which you're dealing with the consequences of a third-party vulnerability, right? And then the third is the increase in ransomware attacks with almost no legal guidance over this. Right? We still don't require companies to disclose, so we're not quite, at a certain level, we're not quite sure what's going on out there. There's there's ransomware insurance because there's sort of a quid pro quo between companies and these nefarious actors, right? We'll pay it off, you keep quiet, you'll go away and I'll get my system back. But obviously the ransomware attacks have significant impact in terms of critical infrastructure. I think 2 nights ago I don't know how much has been disclosed in terms of our major water supply system is now trying to ward off a significant ransomware attack. Okay, so this is what you're living, right? Okay, who's the culprits? Well, first, I don't want, we talk about all this sort of ickiness out there. I mean, the major culprits are still nation actor states, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about the other culprits, right? I mean, in other words, we know who they are. They're China, Iran, and Russia, right? So this is the attack on sorry about this. This is, I always forget the names. This is Midnight Blizzard, also known as Cozy Bear, that is essentially a wing of Russia's intelligence, right? And remember, look at the trajectory of their attacks went from sort of fun and games in the election with the DNC attack, that would have been 2016, to solar winds in 2020, to now Microsoft. I mean, so just think about their trajectory in terms of the kind of disruption. They are known by our intelligence agencies as an entity of Russian intelligence. I don't need to create the linkages, and is connected so they're connected directly to the SolarWinds breach. So these characters just come and go, and companies are making calculations about how much they should or should not pay and what their disclosure and liability is if personal information is taken. I am sure a lot of you spend a lot of time with your general counsels at your offices or lawyers, right? Because they are very worried about the liability of your companies if things are exposed that ought not to have been. But it's not just the big nation states. I want to just do a little bit of an aside. Current events are happening, you know it, right? And so what we're seeing in the systems, this isn't a particular hack, but you can see how it can guide reality, right? This is the rise of the AI-generated fakes. And what they might say about your company, what they might say about your customers, the ways, taking voices of leadership of companies and disclosing information or statements that then become disruptive to the company, right? So a lot of you are dealing with AI as a benefit to your company. In my world, it's a real harm. We haven't figured out, AI has the capacity to make right of boom preparedness and response better, because presumably we'll know where harm is, we'll know where to drive resources. Right now, as a lot of you are reading, it is a lot of noise in the system, right? It is pictures, and what I should say is, so this went viral. This is a child who doesn't actually exist. This made it to the New York Post. It linked. I mean, people are so horrible. I mean, you would think I would know that by now, given my field. It linked to a GoFundMe account, right? So people are seeing this image, and some guy is just making money. I'm sure he's not even close to the area in Helene. And this creates noise in the system, right? So thinking about, you don't have to actually penetrate the wires in cybersecurity. There are things that are just out there now that we just don't know how to manage them right now. And all this talk of better AI and managing the system and stuff, I don't know what to tell you. I wish we were there, but we're not. So we're going to have to figure out ways to deal with the noise. Okay, if that's the case, then why do we get ready for the crash landing? I get ready for it because I measure success by less bad, right? I don't do good. I mean, so if you think about the world you're in, are you ready if the bad thing happens? I know you spend a lot of time trying to stop that boom or disruption, to make things less bad when they do, right? That's your commonality, right? My standard of success is less bad, right? And someone else can do good, and I hope you're all doing good. But if you don't do good, less bad is something you're going to have to sell. It's a challenge, and I get it. It's a challenge for all of you to sort of convince your companies, convince your leadership that being ready, right, the kinds of things that the reason why you're here, the existence for Quails, right, to be ready, to anticipate the harm, to assess risk rationally. It is a hard sell sometimes. And those of you who are in companies in which you're not, the company's doing something else and you're sort of you're like friction, right? Security is friction in the system for a lot of these companies. And you got to convince them that it's good friction, right? I mean, look, airport security is friction in the system, right? People just want to get from point A to point B quickly. You got to make the case about good friction. And it's a paradox. And we call it the preparedness paradox in my space for a reason. Why? Because the better you do at this, the harder it is to convince people that your job is worth retaining. Everyone's nodding now. Yes, it is very difficult to do that, right? It's like, well, nothing bad happened, so let me tell you why I'm necessary, right? And then if the bad thing happens, you get fired. I know, trust me, I'm in the same field, right? Like, it's like nothing, if everything is good, they say, well, she's redundant, and everything is bad, she's fired, right? So, and so it is a preparedness paradox. In some ways, I don't have a perfect answer for you to it, but just to recognize it. And part of the reason why I tell stories about this world, right? And in my world, in media and stuff, is because you all, no offense, but we're pretty bad at telling our stories, right? We like the secrecy or like whatever. Like you need to tell what these investments are about, why products are necessary, how you're using them. Because if they're successful, it's really hard for people to see, right? And knowing that exists, maybe it just will give you a way to think about how am I telling this story. So I want to tell 3. Right. Okay. So this is basically the breakdown of The Devil Never Sleeps, Learning to Live in an Age of Disasters, right? I took hundreds of years of disasters and in typical, make it simple, I sort of focused on 8 key takeaways that you can do. I'm going to focus on the first 3 for you at all. I worked with the team here about what you might be interested in. And I tell these stories through previous disasters. So you could see, I can see what that investment was. Because we tend to think of disasters only as bad, but actually, there are ways to think of what good came out of them, or there's counter stories. So, so the overall way to think about this is I'm going to learn, or I'm going to invest in failing safer. All of you know fail-safe systems. That's the world you're in. I'm safer. Right? I know that sounds weird. I'm sort of casual about, but just you all know this. Like a world of safe is like. Then we won't have an Olympics and then we won't be connected. I mean, I know what safe systems look like. I remember after the Boston Marathon bombing, I was the state Homeland Security advisor for Massachusetts and then moved on to federal government. The next year, reporters asked, well, is the Boston Marathon safe? I was like, you don't just have 26.2 miles, right? You have 52.4, right? No, there's no such thing as safe. Right? Is that we're going to make it safer, but if you want to have the kind of society, the kind of companies that you're representing, the kind of networks that are connected, you're just thinking about how do I make investments left of boom that make, if it comes to the boom, I'm assuming it does, that lower the consequences, that minimize the consequences. So I always think in terms of failing safer, not safe. Though I dream of that, right? I dream of that world. Okay, so what are some of these lessons? I want to tell 3 sort of stories that sort of guided me in terms of some of the lessons learned out of the book. The first is, of course, the sort of conceptualizing that you will be right of boom, and what does that look like? Okay, and the best lesson for this is Fukushima. Has anyone heard of Narragansett? Maybe a few of you. Narragansett is about 30 kilometers from Fukushima, closer to the water. Everyone remembers that this is the 2011. You had the tsunami. You had the earthquake, to the tsunami, to the nuclear radiation melting in Fukushima. So it's like a 3-part disaster for Japan. Right. Okay. So Fukushima and Narragansett are 2 nuclear facilities, not 30 kilometers apart. We know Fukushima. So part of this is what happened at Fukushima. Fukushima was an industry, the nuclear industry was built in Japan under the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right, of the nuclear attacks there. And when Japan realized it needed domestic sources of energy and really invested in nuclear, it had to sell it to its people. And it kind of lied, right? It sort of convinced the people and the industry, coordinated with the industry, to really think that they could stay left of boom. So all the regulations that exist here in the United States, evacuation zones, all that stuff, what do you do in that moment of pressure, are not tested and trained. So the crash landing is coming in. You know the tsunami's coming, right? The airplane's coming in for the crash landing. And the guys, they were all guys, at Fukushima are what? One, they don't have any training. They also, because disaster management is very culturally specific, and there's chain of command that's respected in Japan, they're calling up and up and up and up. To one stage, while the water's rushing in, they're on the phone call with the Prime Minister's office in Tokyo. Not helpful in a crisis, right? I mean, in other words, your runway is short, as they say. Your runway is short. Be ready now, right? So part of this is cultural, part of this is historic, and part of it is just not conceptualizing what would you want to do in your short runway. Go forward to Narragansett, right? Or go next door to Narragansett. It happened to be that its owner wasn't owned by the major company in Japan. Happens to be that its owner was trained in the United States, where we have a love-hate relationship with the nuclear industry here, but it is focused on safety and security after 3 Mile Island. He's trained, he understands what it means to empower your people to respond in real time and anticipate the boom. That's all of your jobs now. They know what they're seeing. They don't ask for permission. And this is, anyone who knows nuclear energy is going to cry when I say this. And they unplugged the system. I know it's not unplugging, but they did something right? So in my world of less bad, right, in failing safer, earthquake destroys, both nuclear facilities are still down. They're decommissioned, right? So they are in bad shape. Both hit by an earthquake, both overwhelmed by a tsunami, radiation leak, no radiation leak. I'm taking the less bad one, right? And so that's the way to think about what do your teams know? And we never tell the story of what went right, right? We all know, and then remember, this becomes a huge story about whether nuclear energy is safe. Honestly, it is, if you know that it's not. Right? If you know that you have to invest in empowering your people to be able to respond. So just always think about your short runway. That's the difference between a crisis and every other problem that we have, right? Your runway is short.
We thought we'd take the opportunity to actually just have a conversation about major themes around cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a big topic, we know, and so we're going to focus today on the topics that you know really well around national security, military security, and I will chime in on Homeland security, which is where my background is. So that's how we're sort of going to play it out the next 50 minutes, and just want to thank you for being here in your service, now in the private sector, but in academia and in the public sector. From the Homeland Security side, the perpetrator was of less interest simply because we didn't have the means to respond to it, whether it was Russia or Iran. I mean, I think the challenges that we experienced were twofold. I mean, one is just the governance challenge. We tend to think of cybersecurity as, .mil, .gov domain. The critical infrastructure is owned 60, 70% by the private sector. And state and local governments retain a lot of information about you and about, whether it's your driver's licenses or this new Real ID that could be easily accessed to. So the challenge, I often say in Homeland Security, the security is the easy part. The Homeland is the hard part, because without standards about what kind of cybersecurity protections, even outside of elections, where there's been a lot of focus, and we'll get to that is of concern to me, is the sort of the state and local aspects of those vulnerabilities. We tend to focus on the .mil and the federal .gov domain. I think the second issue, and it's funny you brought up Sony, I actually assigned the movie for my class. It is awful. It's awful on the seventh time. But the reason why it's a perfect example of one of the challenges we had in the public-private partnership aspect, and this applies to a lot of you, is for companies that don't view themselves as security companies, for them to take seriously their cyber vulnerabilities. So if you're a critical infrastructure, you were saying your border, if you're a critical infrastructure entity, you're that you're vulnerable, especially if you're, PG&E or a water company. You know you're vulnerable, and you're going to have to sort of commit the resources. Sony's a perfect example. A Japanese company with American distribution on this side. It had cybersecurity, but one wouldn't have called it particularly sophisticated. When we looked back at how it happened, it was essentially a single point of failure. It was a system administrator's password got the the North Koreans into the entire system. And Sony, will say, like, they never sort of envision themselves as sort of a national security threat. But I think that there's no distinction now, that you could go after, in the same way terrorists could go after Disneyland, and that would be the same as if they went after the Pentagon. Cyber, a foreign country could do the same with a private company that does not see itself as in critical infrastructure. So getting that group of companies, to the level that you would feel good about is difficult. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you're seeing just on the defense and homeland security side. So if you thought, just picking up on your point, the confidence level, although this could impact the act of voting itself. So if you're the Russians and you're thinking, and this is just all hypothetical, but you've been reading the newspaper in terms of briefings about sort of the Russians' interest and the Bernie Sanders campaign and the Donald Trump campaign. So if you're the Russians and you want Michigan to go to a certain candidate, how do you swing 20,000 votes? That's really hard to do undetected by switching 20,000 votes, right? In Detroit.
Exactly.
But what you could do is, and this gets back to our first point, is you could somehow impact the apparatus that supports voting. So one of the things you're starting to hear the intelligence community talk about publicly in their most recent sort of election public briefing is you could, sort of impact the signals in Detroit so that African American communities could not get to the polls quickly. And if people can't afford to spend 4 hours voting, or you get into the reverse 9/11 system and say there's an active shooter, or you impact the electricity and if you can hit 10 precincts in Detroit, you significantly change the African American, it's voter suppression of a different kind. So I think it's not just the sort of ballot box, right? Which it's hard to do undetected, and there's ways that we're beginning to be able to detect it. And we also have paper ballots now in many places. It's that infrastructure that supports the voting, and that gets to your point, which is confidence. Just picking up on that point, the sort of the fissures in our society. So we see the Russians very engaged with the anti-vax movement, so sort of those fissures about sort of public health, and now you're starting to see disinformation campaigns with support of the Russians as well. Those fissures around the coronavirus, those fissures, are the Chinese hiding a bioterrorism attack? No one in the field actually believes that. Sort of these fissures that make us distracted from what we need to do, which is protect U.S. society from a potential pandemic.
Absolutely, and the latest strain of that, not to make a bad pun on medicine, but the latest strain of disinformation that I've seen over the last couple of days is very chilling, and it is starting to pop in a variety of social networks, which is that coronavirus is going to be so bad that we are going to postpone our election. Think about that. Yeah. Never happened in American history. And yet, I feel the Russian voice in that, and talk about an instantly polarizing issue, because on the left, people will say, oh, conspiracy. This is a way to just kind of prolong the current administration. On the right, they will say that this is being done to undermine the legitimacy of the election, the re-election, in their view of President Trump. So the Russians see this again as a wedge issue, and it is a really dark corner of the coronavirus that, unfortunately, I think you'll hear more of. Another example of this.
Yeah, no, I think, and I want to add, so the military, you spent your career in the military, spends a lot of time, thinking about training and education. And when we talk about this issue, you can get so frustrated because we act like the American public doesn't sort of have a responsibility to sort of educate itself. So getting to are there solutions?
Yeah.
When you think about what the Russians are likely to do in 2020 and the confidence, how can we begin to prepare ourselves for essentially an enemy attack? Yeah. Or are we too divided? I mean, that's the sort of one of the concerns, and we talked about this at the beginning, is sort of the vulnerability of the network around the .mil domain. So from the, as I was saying at the beginning, from the Homeland Security perspective, one, we have no jurisdiction over the .mil domain, but you kind of think the Pentagon's got their act together. There's almost no resource that DHS could help DoD with, and they've got a lot of incentive to protect. And I think one of the things that we're seeing when you see, okay, there's no real distinction between private and public anymore. What a lot of you do is quasi-public sector, right? You are supporting a public mission or a public good by supporting DoD or Department of Energy or whoever else. That network, though, seems to me to be a rather large vulnerability. And there's been a lot of changes at the way the Pentagon is thinking about it, in the same way, we got to get Sony to think about it. And you've been involved with that, so I just thought it'd be helpful to have people sort of understand what is that looking like now, and what changes can they expect. People will ask me about my career, and I always say, get your hands dirty for some period of time. People who sort of go through policy schools, if you don't know how the wires connect, or you don't know, what it means to run an incident command in a crisis or whatever it is, you're not going to understand essentially what people are doing for you if you're in a leadership position or something. It does what you were saying, though, this idea that, what people in cybersecurity do is technical, and I'm the policy thinker, and there's a gap between them. I often tell an anecdote that I do a lot of preparedness consulting, even if it's cybersecurity, that I had a conversation with a CEO once, and a lot of you probably struggle with this, those of you who are in companies that do not view themselves as security companies, but you're the security person or the CISO, or I asked the CEO, I said, how often do you meet your COO? He goes, multiple times a day, right? And then how often do you meet with your CFO? Well, no less than 2 times a week we have a scheduled meeting. So what about your chief security officer, your chief information security officer? He literally said this to me, he goes, he's former FBI, he knows what he's doing. I mean, you could not imagine a
Totally
CEO
right.
saying that about their CFO or their COO, right? You take but this idea that, well, that's something that experts know, and I have no responsibility to know it. You couldn't imagine that in any other space.